Winter came down from the mountains like a sentence. By the first week of December, the road into Copper Ridge had disappeared beneath hard white drifts. Fence posts stood alone in the snow, their rails buried. The creek froze clear to its stony bed, and the wind drove loose powder through every crack it could find. At night, the cold tightened nails in the roofs and made the buildings groan. Silas Vale heard those sounds from the small room behind the livery stable. He had lived there for 6 years, long enough to know which boards complained and which ones were near breaking. Before dawn each morning, he rose from his narrow cot, lit a lamp, and warmed his hands above the flame before pulling on his boots. Then he went out to tend the horses. The animals watched him through clouds of breath. Silas carried water from the pump, broke ice from the troughs, forked hay into the stalls, and checked every hoof. He worked quietly. The horses understood quiet better than most people did. Copper Ridge called him a gunslinger, though he had not drawn against a man in nearly 7 years. Some remembered the name Silas Vale from handbills and saloon stories. Others knew only that he wore a revolver low on his right hip and never sat with his back toward a door. Children watched him from behind their mothers' skirts. Men who had been drinking sometimes spoke louder when he entered a room, hoping he might notice their courage. Silas rarely did. He ate most meals alone at the back table of Maudie Kerr's boarding house. He paid his rent on time, repaired harnesses for the livery owner, and spoke when speech was required. The town had learned to leave him to himself. That December, people needed something brighter than another night spent listening to the wind. The churchwomen began planning a winter dance in the assembly hall. They gathered candles, polished lantern glass, and persuaded the musicians from Stanton Creek to make the journey if the road opened. Paper stars appeared in shop windows. Garlands of pine were tied around porch rails. The blacksmith's daughters practiced steps in the street until their mother chased them inside. Silas watched the preparations without interest. He had not danced since he was 20, and that memory belonged to a life he no longer visited. On the afternoon the first invitation was nailed to the livery door. Silas was fitting a shoe to a bay mare when the stagecoach bell sounded beyond the North Ridge. The sound was faint and uneven. No coach was expected. The pass had been declared unsafe 2 days earlier. Silas stepped outside. Snow moved across the road in long white ribbons. Through it came the shape of the stagecoach, tilted badly to one side. One horse was limping. The driver stood in the box, hauling the reins with both hands. Silas took his coat from the peg. He saddled a gray gelding and rode into the storm. The coach had stopped half a mile from town, where the road dipped between 2 banks. Its rear wheel had split, and the axle rested in the snow. The driver was cursing beneath his scarf. A woman stood beside the coach. She wore a dark brown coat too thin for the weather. Snow clung to the wool and gathered along the brim of her plain black hat. One gloved hand held a small valise. The other rested against the coach for balance. Her face was pale from cold, but she did not complain. "There's another passenger inside," the driver called. Silas dismounted. Inside the coach he found an elderly salesman wrapped in 2 blankets and shaking badly. Silas carried the man to his horse, secured him in the saddle, and told the driver to walk beside him. Then he looked at the woman. "Can you manage the distance?" "I believe so." Her voice was steady. Her teeth were not. Silas took the valise from her hand. She resisted for a moment before releasing it. "I can carry my own things. You can carry them after your fingers work again." She looked at him carefully. Most people in Copper Ridge recognized Silas before he spoke. This woman did not seem to know him at all. He preferred it that way. They walked toward town behind the horse. The wind pushed against their backs, then shifted without warning and struck their faces. Twice, the woman stumbled. Both times, she recovered before Silas could reach for her. At the first buildings, the driver pointed toward Maudie Kerr's boarding house. That's where she asked to go. Silas carried the valise to the porch. Warm light shone through the curtains. Music came faintly from inside, where Maudie's niece was practicing a hymn on the parlor piano. The woman stopped before climbing the steps. "Thank you, Mr. Vale." Something changed in her expression. It was small, but he saw it. "You have heard the name. My husband had." The door opened before Silas could answer. Maudie Kerr rushed out with a shawl around her shoulders. "Clara Hart?" The woman nodded. Maudie took her hands and pulled her toward the warmth. "We thought you would not make it through the pass." Neither did the wheel. Maudie looked at Silas. "Bring that bag inside before the poor woman freezes." Silas set the valise in the entrance hall. As he turned to leave, Clara Hart removed her hat. Her dark hair was pinned simply at the back of her head. A narrow silver chain disappeared beneath the collar of her dress. "Mr. Vale," he looked over his shoulder. "I am grateful." Silas nodded once. Outside, snow had already begun filling his footprints. Clara Hart had come to Copper Ridge because Maudie needed a seamstress. The town's only dressmaker had married a cattle buyer and moved east in October. Maudie owned the empty shop beside the boarding house and had placed advertisements in 3 newspapers. Clara had answered from Missouri, writing that she was a widow, that she had worked with cloth since childhood, and that she could pay the first month's rent upon arrival. That was all Maudie had known. By morning, the town knew more. Clara's husband had been Nathan Hart, a gambler and sometime freight guard who had died in a gunfight outside Independence. Depending on who told the story, Nathan had been defending himself, robbing a payroll wagon, or fleeing with stolen money. His widow had left Missouri 2 weeks after his burial. Nothing traveled faster through Copper Ridge than a suspicion carried by someone with an empty afternoon. Silas heard the first whispers at the pump. He heard the second version while repairing a harness. By evening, men at the saloon claimed Clara had hidden $10,000 beneath her skirts and crossed 3 territories ahead of the law. Silas continued stitching leather. The next morning, Clara opened the sewing shop. She swept the floor, washed the windows, and arranged 3 bolts of cloth on a shelf. She placed a small wooden sign on the door. Clara Hart, seamstress and alterations. For the first 2 days, no one entered. On the third, the blacksmith's wife brought a torn work shirt. She remained near the doorway and watched Clara closely while discussing the repair. Clara measured the cloth, named a fair price, and promised it by Friday. On Friday morning, the shirt was folded on the counter. The tear could barely be seen. By the following week, there were 6 garments waiting on hooks. Silas passed the shop each morning, on his way to the feed store. He often saw Clara through the glass, seated beneath the window with her head bent over her work. Her hands moved quickly and surely. She did not look up when townspeople slowed outside. She did not appear to notice when conversations stopped as she entered the general store. Silas knew the skill required to pretend not to hear. One afternoon, he returned to his room and found a neat patch covering the torn elbow of his winter coat. He carried it into the livery. Old Tom Grady, the stable owner, was sweeping the aisle. "You do that?" Tom looked offended. "I know how to mend a gate. I do not know how to mend a sleeve." Silas examined the stitching. The thread matched the faded black wool almost perfectly. He crossed the street to Clara's shop. She was cutting blue fabric on the long table. "You repaired my coat." Clara continued cutting. "Mr. Grady brought it to me. He did not pay you." "No." Silas placed 2 coins on the table. She glanced at them. "The seam required 10 minutes. The coat kept me warm 6 winters. 1 coin is enough." He removed one. Clara looked at the remaining coin, then at him. "You are not accustomed to accepting favors." "No, neither am I." Silas considered this. Then he picked up the second coin and left the first. The next morning, a stack of split firewood appeared beside the stove in Clara's shop. She did not ask who had left it. 2 days later, Silas found a strip of thick wool wrapped around the handle of the water pump behind the livery. The metal no longer froze to his glove. Neither of them mentioned it. The weeks settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara arrived at her shop before sunrise. Silas saw the lamp come on while he carried hay to the horses. At noon, she ate a piece of bread beside the window. Silas usually crossed the street once the church bell struck 12 and placed a tin cup of coffee on the sill outside. The first time she came to the door. "You left this. It is coffee. I know what it is. Then we understand each other." Her mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. The next day, the empty cup waited on a folded square of clean cloth. When snow buried the path between the shop and the boarding house, Silas cleared it before she arrived. When his gloves split along the palms, Clara repaired them and returned them through Tom Grady. They spoke little. Silas learned that Clara disliked cinnamon and added too much sugar to her coffee. Clara learned that Silas checked the livery door 3 times before going to bed. He learned that she hummed while working, but only when she believed herself alone. She learned that he kept pieces of apple in his pocket for an old chestnut mare no one else could approach. The town noticed their small exchanges. Copper Ridge always noticed. Women began inviting Clara into conversation, though some did so only to learn what she might reveal. Men entered the sewing shop with buttons missing from otherwise sound coats. Clara treated each person with the same careful courtesy. She offered no stories about Nathan Hart. She wore her wedding ring on a chain beneath her dress. One evening, Silas found her standing outside the shop after dark. The wind had quieted. Snow lay smooth across the street, reflecting the lanterns in the windows. Clara held a paper invitation. "You received one," Silas said. "So did every unmarried woman and widow in town." "The dance." She nodded. A pine branch had been printed along the top of the paper. Beneath it were the date and the names of the church committee. "You going?" he asked. "I have not decided." Silas looked toward the assembly hall. Men were carrying benches through the front doors. "You like music. I like hearing it." "That was not my question." Clara folded the invitation. "No one has asked me. The dance is 3 weeks away. That is not much time for a man to become foolish." Silas heard the humor in her words, but it did not reach her eyes. He wanted to say that men often became foolish much faster. Instead, he nodded toward the shop. "You should go inside. The temperature is falling." Clara looked at him for another moment. "Good night, Mr. Vale." "Good night, Mrs. Hart." He walked back to the livery, with the cold pressing through his repaired gloves. The next morning, Silas found an envelope beneath his door. There was no name on the front. Inside was a newspaper clipping, folded twice. He opened it beneath the lamp. The article was dated 8 months earlier. It described the robbery of a railroad payroll near Independence. 2 guards had been wounded. A man named Nathan Hart was believed to have helped the robbers escape. The stolen money had not been recovered. A handwritten line appeared beneath the article. "Ask the widow what she brought west." Silas burned the note in the stove. He kept the clipping. That afternoon, a stranger entered the livery. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a frost-covered beard and a badge beneath his coat. He introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Edwin Rusk. "I am looking for Mrs. Clara Hart." Silas continued, rubbing oil into a saddle strap. "You found the town. I am told you found the woman. In a broken coach." Rusk studied him. "You are Silas Vale." Silas set down the cloth. "What do you want with her?" "Questions." "Ask them. They are not for you." Rusk stepped closer. "Nathan Hart helped steal a railroad payroll. We believe he gave the money to his wife before he died." "We?" "The railroad. The marshal's office. Men who do not enjoy losing money. Silas looked at the badge again. It was scratched and worn, but genuine. You have a warrant? Not yet. Then ask politely. Rusk smiled without warmth. I remember stories about you. Stories improve with distance. So do wanted men. Silas met his eyes. I am not wanted. Not anymore. Rusk left the livery and crossed toward Clara's shop. Silas followed at a distance. Through the window, he saw Rusk remove his hat. Clara remained behind the cutting table. They spoke for several minutes. Her face did not change. When Rusk left, the town had already gathered enough pieces to form its own judgment. By supper, people said the widow had brought stolen money to Copper Ridge. The next day, 2 customers collected unfinished dresses from Clara's shop. A third demanded the return of her cloth. Clara handed everything over without argument. Silas brought coffee at noon. She did not open the door. He left the cup on the sill. It remained there until the coffee froze. That evening, he found her behind the boarding house, attempting to split a log with a small hatchet. The blade struck crookedly and lodged in the wood. Silas took the handle. I can do it. I have no doubt. He freed the hatchet and split the log with one blow. Clara folded her arms. You heard. Everyone heard. And the town enjoys a fire more when it believes someone else will burn. She looked toward the dark windows of the boarding house. Marshal Rusk thinks Nathan gave me the payroll money. Did he? Her gaze returned to Silas. No. He waited. Clara's shoulders lowered slightly. That is all you are going to ask? You answered. You do not know if I am telling the truth. No. Then why believe me? Silas placed another log on the block. Because you looked at me when you said it. That is not proof. No. He split the log. Clara watched the pieces fall apart. Nathan lied while looking directly at people. Then he was better practiced than you. She turned away, but not before he saw the brief smile. They stacked the firewood together. Afterward, Clara brought 2 cups of coffee from the boarding house kitchen. They stood beneath the overhang while snow began falling again. Nathan knew you, she said. Silas held his cup between both hands. I met him once. Where? Abilene. Clara waited. Silas looked across the yard. Nathan Hart had been younger then, dressed in a bright vest and surrounded by men who laughed too easily. He had tried to draw on Silas over a card game Silas had not been playing. Silas had shot the pistol from Nathan's hand. The bullet broke 2 of Nathan's fingers. I stopped him from making a mistake, Silas said. He blamed you for that hand until the day he died. He should have blamed the whiskey. Clara looked into her cup. He blamed everyone. Silas heard what rested beneath the words. He did not ask her to uncover it. The dance drew closer. The committee continued decorating the assembly hall, though conversations changed whenever Clara passed. The blacksmith's daughters no longer practiced in front of her shop. Men who had once invented reasons to enter now crossed the street. Silas continued leaving coffee. Clara continued repairing his clothes. A week before the dance, a blizzard swept across the valley. The storm began before noon and erased the mountains by 3. Wind tore shingles from the feed store roof. Lanterns vanished behind walls of snow. Families gathered in the church basement because its stone foundation held heat better than the wooden houses. Silas remained at the livery with the horses. Near dusk, the back door opened. Clara stepped inside, carrying a basket. Snow covered her coat from collar to hem. What are you doing here? Maudie made stew. You crossed the street in this? The street is not a mountain range. It was difficult enough that you tied rope around your waist. Silas looked toward the open door. A rope stretched into the storm, its other end secured to the boarding house porch. Clara set the basket on a barrel. I assumed you would not leave the animals. You assumed correctly. They ate stew on overturned buckets while the storm struck the walls. The horses shifted in their stalls. Clara spoke softly to them when the thunder of the wind made them nervous. Later, a section of roofing above the tack room tore loose. Silas climbed into the loft with a hammer and boards. Clara held the lantern below. "Move away from the wall," he called. "You need light. I need you out of the way if the roof comes down." "The roof will not come down. You know that?" "No, but you are still standing beneath it." Silas looked at her through the loft opening. Clara lifted the lantern higher. He secured the boards. Near midnight, they sat beside the small stove in his room. Clara's coat hung from a nail. Her hair had loosened around her face. Silas gave her his blanket. "You are shaking. So are you. I am older. By perhaps 5 years. 7. That is not old enough to become noble." He looked at her. This time her smile remained. The storm quieted near morning. Clara fell asleep in the chair with the blanket around her shoulders. Silas sat on the floor against the wall, listening to her breathe. He had spent years training himself not to need the sound of another person nearby. He discovered that the body could forget its training in a single night. At dawn, Clara woke and folded the blanket carefully. Neither mentioned that Silas had stayed awake. The dance was held 3 nights later. The storm had cleared, leaving a sky bright with stars. Snowbanks rose above the windows. Men shoveled a path to the assembly hall, and lanterns were placed every 10 feet. Music began shortly after sunset. Silas remained in the livery. He brushed the gray gelding. He cleaned tools that were already clean. He checked the back door twice, then a 3rd time. Across the street, sleigh bells arrived in groups. Women passed the windows in colored dresses beneath heavy cloaks. Men stamped snow from polished boots. Silas had no reason to attend. He repeated this while shaving. He repeated it while putting on his clean black shirt. He repeated it while fastening the gun belt around his waist. Then he crossed the street. The assembly hall glowed with candlelight. Pine garlands lined the walls. Paper stars hung from the rafters. At the far end, 3 musicians played a lively reel, while couples moved across the floor. Silas stopped near the door. Conversations softened around him. He saw Maudie Kerr serving cider. He saw Tom Grady attempting to dance with the blacksmith's wife, while her husband laughed. Then he saw Clara. She stood beside the north wall beneath a paper star. Her dress was dark green, plain except for a narrow line of black stitching at the cuffs. She had pinned her hair higher than usual. A small silver comb caught the candlelight. She stood alone. 3 widowers attended the dance. 2 unmarried ranchers had come from the South Valley. Each passed Clara without asking for her hand. One man approached, spoke briefly, then glanced toward Deputy Marshal Rusk near the cider table. The man gave Clara an apologetic nod and walked away. Clara remained straight-backed. Only her hands betrayed her. She held them tightly together at her waist. Silas crossed the room. People moved aside before he reached them. The musicians finished the reel. A slower tune began. Silas stopped in front of Clara. She looked at him with quiet surprise. He removed his hat. "Mrs. Hart." "Mr. Vale." Silas held out his hand. "I do not dance well." Clara looked at his hand, then at his face. "Neither do I." That makes the matter fair. The room had grown strangely quiet, though the music continued. Clara placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold. Silas led her onto the floor. He remembered fewer steps than he had hoped. Clara stepped on his boot once. He turned too slowly and nearly guided her into another couple. Neither apologized. They moved carefully beneath the candlelight. One hand joined between them. Silas kept his other hand at the middle of her back. Clara's gaze rested near his collar for the first half of the song. Then she looked up. "Everyone is watching. They will tire eventually. You have frightened half the room." "Only half." Clara gave a small laugh. The sound loosened something inside his chest. They completed one turn, then another. Silas had faced men with rifles, crossed deserts without water, and slept in places where strangers searched his pockets before deciding whether to kill him. None of it required the courage of holding Clara Hart where everyone could see. The music ended. Silas did not release her hand. Deputy Marshal Rusk stepped onto the floor. Mrs. Hart. Clara's fingers tightened. Rusk held a folded document. I received a warrant this afternoon. The room fell silent. You will come with me to the boarding house. We are searching your room and shop. Maudie pushed through the crowd. You will not tear apart my property. The warrant allows it. Clara released Silas and faced the marshal. You will find no payroll money. Then the search will be brief. Rusk turned toward the door. Clara followed. Silas went with them. The town came behind. Rusk searched the boarding house room first. He emptied drawers, opened Clara's valise, and shook out each dress. He examined the mattress and removed the boards beneath the washstand. Nothing appeared. At the sewing shop, he opened cabinets and unrolled fabric. He turned over the cutting table. Then he found the wooden music box. It rested on the shelf behind a stack of patterns. The box was small, with a faded picture of blue flowers painted on the lid. Clara stepped forward. That belonged to my mother. Rusk opened it. A thin melody sounded. He examined the lining, then pressed his thumb against the bottom. The wood shifted. A hidden compartment opened beneath the mechanism. Inside lay a packet of papers. The people crowded near the doorway whispered. Rusk removed the packet. There was no money. The papers were railroad schedules, names, and payment records. One page listed 6 men, including Nathan Hart. Beside each name was an amount. Rusk looked at Clara. You knew this was here. She stood very still. I found it after Nathan died. This proves he helped plan the robbery. Yes. Why did you keep it? I did not know who to trust. You could have taken it to the marshal in Independence. The marshal in Independence is named on the final page. Rusk turned the paper. His expression changed. Silas saw fear before the deputy concealed it. A voice came from outside. She always was a clever woman. 3 men stood in the street. The man in the center wore a buffalo coat and carried a rifle across his chest. Silas recognized him from the newspaper clipping. Caleb Wren, one of the suspected payroll robbers. The other 2 men spread apart. Townspeople backed into the shop. Wren smiled at Clara. Nathan said you never understood business. Clara's face had lost its color. Silas stepped through the doorway. Leave the street. Wren looked at him. Silas Vale. The name pleased him. I wondered whether the stories were true. They are mostly lies. Which part? The part where men get a second chance. Wren's smile faded. Deputy Rusk moved beside Silas and drew his revolver. The motion was uncertain. Wren lifted the rifle. Silas drew once. His shot struck the rifle near the trigger guard. The weapon twisted from Wren's hands and landed in the snow. Rusk aimed at the second man. Tom Grady appeared at the livery door with a shotgun leveled from his shoulder. The blacksmith stood beside him holding a heavy revolver. Windows opened along the street. Copper Ridge had made its judgment quickly, but the town was capable of changing its mind when danger stood plainly before it. Wren looked from Silas to the armed townspeople. His hands rose. No second shot was fired. Rusk bound the 3 men in the livery. The papers from the music box were placed in his coat. By the time it was done, the musicians had gone home. The assembly hall remained lit, but the dance was over. Clara stood alone beneath the porch roof of her shop. Silas approached. Snow had begun falling gently. It settled in her hair and along the shoulders of her green dress. You should go inside, he said. I seem to hear that from you often. The temperature is falling. It usually is. Silas stood beside her. Across the street, Tom Grady locked the livery. Deputy Rusk guarded the prisoners inside. Clara watched the snow. Nathan gave me the music box 3 days before he died. He told me never to open it. Silas waited. I opened it after the funeral. I saw the names. I understood why men had been watching the house. That is why you came west. Maudie's advertisement gave me somewhere to go. You should have told me. I thought you might look at me as they did. Silas glanced toward the assembly hall. I have been looked at that way for years. You earned some of it. Yes. Clara turned toward him. That is not the same. No. For a moment, neither spoke. Silas could hear the faint sound of a horse moving inside the livery. Clara touched the silver chain at her throat. I did not keep Nathan's secrets because I loved what he had done. I kept them because I was afraid his crimes had become mine. They did not. The town may not agree tomorrow. Then the town can be wrong tomorrow. She studied his face. You offered me your hand before you knew whether I had lied. I knew enough. What did you know? Silas looked down at her. The truth felt too large for the narrow space beneath the porch, but it came out in plain words. I knew I looked for your lamp every morning. Clara's hand fell from the chain. Silas continued. I knew the coffee tasted wrong when you would not take it. I knew the livery felt empty after the blizzard, though every stall was full. Her eyes shone, but no tears fell. That is not a small thing to say, Mr. Vale. No. Are you certain? No. Clara nodded slowly. That seems honest. Silas held out his hand again. There was no music now, no candlelight, no room full of watching faces. Only snow, cold air, and the boards beneath their feet. Clara placed her hand in his. They stood that way until Maudie opened the boarding house door and called them both fools for remaining outside. Winter held Copper Ridge for another 2 months. Deputy Rusk took Caleb Wren and the others east when the pass opened. The papers cleared Clara of suspicion and exposed 3 men involved in the robbery, including the marshal in Independence. The railroad offered Clara a reward. She refused most of it, accepting only the money Nathan had taken from her own savings. The town found other matters to discuss. Customers returned to the sewing shop. Some apologized, most did not. Clara served them with the same careful courtesy as before. Silas kept bringing coffee. Clara began opening the door before he reached the sill. On cold evenings, she crossed to the livery with a basket from Maudie's kitchen. They ate beside the stove while the horses settled for the night. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they listened to the wind. In March, water began dripping from the eaves. The first dark patches of earth appeared near the south-facing walls. The road softened into mud, and the creek woke beneath its thinning ice. One evening, Silas repaired the hinge on Clara's shop door. When he finished, he found her standing behind him in a simple gray dress. She held the wooden music box. I thought you might keep this for me. Silas looked at it. It belonged to your mother. Yes. Then it belongs with you. Clara ran one finger across the painted flowers. I would like it somewhere safe. Silas understood. He took the box. His room behind the livery had one shelf above the stove. He cleared the tools from it and placed the music box in the center. Clara watched from the doorway. It looks lonely there, she said. Silas looked at the empty shelf. It has room. For what? Whatever comes next. Clara stepped inside. She closed the door against the evening chill, crossed the small room, and placed her hand in his. This time, neither of them needed music.